The musket ball whistled past Colonel William Prescott's ear with a sound like death itself, embedding in the earthwork behind him with a dull thud. Sweat streamed down his weathered face as he crouched behind the hastily constructed redoubt atop Breed's Hill, watching the scarlet tide of British regulars advance up the slope for the third time. That sweltering June morning, it was the 17th of June, 1775, and the very fate of the Colonial Rebellion hung in the balance on this blood-soaked Massachusetts hillside. "Hold your fire, men," Prescott's voice cut through the acrid smoke that hung like a funeral shroud over the battlefield. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The order had become legendary even before the battle ended, but in that moment, it was born of grim necessity rather than bravado. Every grain of black powder was precious now, every lead ball a treasure more valuable than silver. The Colonial forces had started the day with perhaps 40 rounds per man, but after the devastating volleys that had sent the British reeling back down the hill, in bloody confusion, their ammunition pouches were growing dangerously light. The morning had begun with such promise. Under cover of darkness, over 1,000 Colonial militiamen had marched from Cambridge, their boots silent on the dirt roads as they made their way toward the Charlestown Peninsula. General Artemas Ward had ordered them to fortify Bunker Hill, the highest point on the peninsula, but Colonel Prescott had made a fateful decision. Breed's Hill, though lower, sat closer to Boston Harbor and would better threaten the British fleet anchored below. It was a gamble that would cost many lives before the sun set. As dawn broke over Boston Harbor, the British awakened to find the rebels had transformed the landscape overnight. Where yesterday there had been empty pasture, now stood an imposing earthen fort bristling with Colonial muskets. Admiral Samuel Graves aboard his flagship immediately ordered the warships to open fire, and the thunderous cannonade began. Round shots screamed overhead and crashed into the redoubt, sending showers of dirt and splintered timber flying, but the Colonials held their ground. According to historical accounts preserved in the Massachusetts Historical Society archives, the psychological impact of that morning cannot be overstated. General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, had awakened to find his enemy literally on his doorstep, their fortifications commanding the harbor itself. The rebellion that he had dismissed as the work of a few malcontents had suddenly taken on the appearance of a genuine military threat. Young Peter Salem, a freed slave fighting alongside his former master's sons, pressed his back against the earthen wall and checked his cartridge box one more time. 12 rounds remained. Around him, men were doing the same grim arithmetic, counting their remaining ammunition with the solemnity of mourners counting prayers. They all knew what those empty cartridge boxes would mean when the British came again, as they surely would. The Redcoats had already tried twice to take the hill, and twice the withering Colonial fire had sent them tumbling back down the slope, leaving their dead scattered like broken scarecrows across the grass. But this third assault would be different. The Colonials could hear the officers shouting orders below, could see the fresh reserves being brought up to replace the bloodied units that had already tasted Colonial lead. Time was running out, and with it, their powder and shot. The British drums beat out their deadly rhythm as Major General William Howe surveyed the carnage spread across the hillside below him. His elegant uniform, once pristine in the morning light, was now stained with mud and the blood of his fallen soldiers. Around him, his staff officers stood in stunned silence, their faces pale as they contemplated the magnitude of their losses. The full assaults had been repulsed with such devastating effect that veteran sergeants who had fought from India to the Caribbean stood shaking their heads in disbelief. "Sir," Captain Harris of the 5th Foot ventured hesitantly, "perhaps we should consider a different approach. The rebels have clearly—" "The rebels?" Howe cut him off sharply. "Are farmers and shopkeepers playing at war. They cannot possibly withstand a third determined assault." But even as he spoke the words, doubt not at his confidence. The morning's events had shattered more than British bones. They had cracked the very foundation of British military doctrine. These Colonial militiamen were supposed to break and run at the first sight of steel, yet they had stood like veterans behind their earthworks, delivering volley after devastating volley with a precision that would have made the Prussian Guard proud. The first assault had been launched with typical British confidence. Howe had personally led the light infantry against the Colonial left flank, while Brigadier General Robert Piggott attacked the redoubt directly. The plan was simple: overwhelm the rebels with superior discipline and firepower, then pursue them. As they fled in panic back to Cambridge, instead, The British had met a wall of flame that cut down officers and men alike with ruthless efficiency. The colonial marksmen, many of them veterans of the French and Indian War, had picked their targets with the cold skill of professional hunters. Behind the earthworks, Dr. Joseph Warren knelt beside a wounded militiaman, his physician's hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Warren, one of the most prominent patriots in Massachusetts and a member of the Provincial Congress, had insisted on fighting as a simple volunteer rather than accepting a commission. Now, with his black coat torn and powder-stained, he embodied the citizen soldier ideal that had brought these men to this deadly hilltop. "How are we fixed for powder, Colonel?" Warren asked as Prescott crouched beside him to check on the wounded man. Prescott's weathered face was grim. "Not well, Doctor. Most of the men are down to their last few rounds." If the British come again with the same determination, he left the sentence unfinished. But both men understood the implication. The second British assault had been even more costly than the first. Learning from their initial failure, Howe had concentrated his attack on the redoubt itself, reasoning that once the fort fell, the entire colonial line would collapse. Again, the redcoats had climbed the hill in perfect formation, their bayonets gleaming in the summer sun. Again, the colonial volleys had torn great gaps in their ranks, sending them reeling back down the slope in bloody disorder. But each repulse came at a price the colonials could ill afford. Every shot fired brought them closer to the moment when their muskets would fall silent, leaving them defenseless against British steel. The men knew it, and the knowledge showed in their faces as they crouched behind their earthworks, checking and rechecking their dwindling ammunition supplies. Sergeant William Scott of the Massachusetts militia had fought at Louisburg during the last war, and he recognized the signs of impending crisis around him. Young farmers, who had never heard a shot fired in anger 3 months ago, were displaying the steady nerves of veterans, but even veterans needed powder and ball to fight. He counted his remaining cartridges again. 8. Not enough. Not nearly enough for what was coming. The sun climbed higher over Boston Harbor as Major General Henry Clinton watched the third assault. Forming up below him, Clinton, the most tactically astute of the British commanders, had argued against the frontal attacks that had already cost them so dearly. But his counsel had been overruled. Now, as he observed Howe's preparations through his telescope, he could only pray that raw courage would succeed. Where tactical finesse had failed, "They're stripping their packs, sir," reported Lieutenant Morrison, his voice tight with nervous energy. Clinton nodded grimly. The sight of British grenadiers casting aside their heavy equipment was always a prelude to desperate fighting. Howe had learned hard lessons from the morning's bloodshed, and this final assault would be different. No longer would his men advance in perfect parade ground formation, presenting magnificent targets for colonial marksmen. This time they would come fast and hard, closing the distance before the rebels could reload. Inside the redoubt, the colonial defenders made their own grim preparations. Ammunition was distributed with the solemnity of communion wine, each cartridge carefully counted and precious beyond measure. Men who had started the day with 40 rounds now clutched perhaps half a dozen, knowing that when these were gone, only cold steel would stand between them and defeat. Colonel Prescott moved among his men like a father among his sons, his calm demeanor belying the desperation of their situation. At 50 years old, he had seen enough of war to know that battles were won not just with powder and shot, but with the iron determination of men who refused to yield. "Remember, boys," he called out, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of British drums. "We came here to make a stand, and by God, we'll make one they'll remember." Private Amos Farnsworth from Groton checked his musket's priming one final time, then peered over the earthwork at the masses of British soldiers gathering below. The sight should have filled him with terror, but instead he felt an odd calm settling over him. These past months had transformed him from a simple farmer into something harder, something more resolute. The British could take this hill, but they would pay a price that would echo through the ages. According to military historians referenced in David Hackett Fisher's comprehensive work, Paul Revere's Ride, The Psychological Transformation of the Colonial Forces During the Spring of 1775, represented one of the most remarkable military developments in American history. Men who had never conceived of challenging royal authority were now prepared to die, rather than submit to what they saw as tyrannical oppression. The British artillery had fallen silent, their gunners unable to elevate their pieces high enough to reach the hilltop fortifications. Now the only sounds were the steady beat of drums and the harsh commands of officers preparing their men for the final assault. Howe himself would lead this attack, his sword drawn and his face set in lines of grim determination. He had already lost more men this morning than in any single engagement of his long career, but retreat was unthinkable. British prestige throughout the empire hung in the balance on this blood-soaked Massachusetts hillside. Dr. Warren had discarded his black coat and rolled up his sleeves, moving among the wounded with quiet efficiency. As a physician, he had seen death in many forms, but the carnage of this morning had shocked even his experienced eyes. Yet he remained, tending to shattered bodies and offering what comfort he could to boys who would never see their farms again. The moment of truth was approaching. Down the slope, 3,000 British regulars were forming their final battle line, their scarlet uniforms bright as blood against the green Massachusetts grass. In a few minutes, they would begin their climb, and the fate of the rebellion would be decided by whatever powder remained in Colonial cartridge boxes. The British advance began with mechanical precision that would have been beautiful to watch under different circumstances. 3,000 scarlet-clad soldiers moved up the hill in perfect formation, their bayonets fixed and their faces set with professional determination. Major General Howe strode at their head, his sword raised high, personally leading what he hoped would be the war's decisive charge. But the Colonials were ready. Despite their dwindling ammunition, they held their fire with iron discipline. Watching the red tide flow up the slope toward them, Colonel Prescott stood atop the parapet, fully exposed to enemy fire, his calm presence steadying nerves that had been stretched to the breaking point. "Steady, boys," he called out. "Let them come close. Make every shot count." Behind him, Captain Thomas Knowlton of Connecticut had positioned his men along the rail fence that protected the Colonial left flank. These were frontier fighters, men who had learned to shoot by hunting game in the dense New England forests. They understood that when ammunition was scarce, patience became a weapon more valuable than gunpowder. Each man selected his target and waited, watching the British officers who rode ahead of their formations, knowing that removing the enemy's leadership would create chaos in their ranks. The silence was unnaturally profound. Even the British drums had stopped, leaving only the sound of hundreds of feet crushing grass and the harsh breathing of men climbing a steep hill under the weight of full military equipment. Young Corporal Matthews of the Cambridge militia found himself counting his remaining cartridges obsessively, 4, 5 if he had miscounted. Around him, other men were doing the same mental arithmetic, calculating how many enemies they could drop before the line inevitably broke out at 40 yards. Prescott's voice rang out like thunder. Fire! The Colonial volley erupted like the crack of doom itself, a sheet of flame that stretched along the entire defensive line. The effect was catastrophic. British officers toppled from their horses, sergeants doubled over and fell, and great gaps appeared in the advancing formations. But this time, instead of recoiling in shock, the surviving redcoats pressed forward with desperate courage. Private Peter Salem, the freed slave who had become one of the rebellion's most dedicated fighters, took careful aim at a British major who was urging his men forward through the smoke. The range was perfect, perhaps 30 yards, and Salem's frontier-made musket was as accurate as any weapon on the battlefield. He squeezed the trigger and watched the officer crumple, then immediately began the practice motions of reloading. But when he reached for his cartridge box, his fingers found only empty leather dot all along the line. The same terrible realization was dawning. Men were firing their final shots, knowing that when the smoke cleared, they would face British bayonets with empty muskets. Yet not one man broke from the ranks. These farmers and shopkeepers had found something within themselves that even they had not known existed, the willingness to die rather than yield. Major John Pitcairn of the Royal Marines, the same officer who had commanded at Lexington 2 months earlier, led a squad of Marines directly toward the redoubt's entrance. He had sworn to end this rebellion personally, and now he seemed within moments of achieving that goal. But as he raised his sword to order the final charge, a musket ball fired by Peter Salem struck him in the chest, and he fell mortally wounded into the arms of his son, who was serving as his aide. The death of Pitcairn seemed to galvanize the British attack. With savage cries, the redcoats surged forward, their bayonets lowered for the killing thrust. The Colonials met them with musket butts and stones, fighting with the desperation of men who knew they were making their last stand. Hand to hand, Combat raged along the earthworks as farmers grappled with professional soldiers in a struggle that would determine the future of a continent. Dr. Warren, who had remained in the redoubt despite having no military obligation to do so, fell with a British musket ball through his head, becoming one of the rebellion's first martyrs. Around him, the Colonial line was finally beginning to crack under the weight of superior numbers and steel. The redoubt had become a slaughterhouse where friend and foe died together in the choking smoke and dust. Colonel Prescott, his uniform torn and his face blackened with powder smoke, fought with the desperate strength of a man who knew he was witnessing the birth or death of a nation. Around him, his militiamen wielded their empty muskets like clubs, refusing to yield ground even as British bayonets found their marks. Captain Knowlton's Connecticut men along the rail fence were making their own heroic stand. These woodsmen had exhausted their ammunition but continued to harry the British flanking movement with stones and captured weapons. Knowlton himself, though mortally wounded, continued to direct his men's resistance until a British grenadier's bayonet finally silenced his commands forever. The retreat, when it finally came, was conducted with a discipline that amazed even British observers. Despite being overwhelmed and nearly out of ammunition, the colonial forces did not break into panic flight. Instead, they conducted a fighting withdrawal that allowed most of their number to escape across Charlestown Neck to safety. Men covered their comrades' retreat with the last of their powder, then fell back in good order to prepare positions. Private Farnsworth found himself among the last to leave the redoubt, helping to carry wounded comrades who could not walk on their own. A British ball had creased his skull, and blood streamed down his face, but he remained conscious and determined to see his friends to safety. Behind him, the Union Jack was finally raised over the earthwork that had cost the British Empire so dearly to capture. Major General Howe stood among the bodies scattered across the hilltop and surveyed his Pyrrhic victory with hollow eyes. Around him lay over 1,000 British casualties, including many of his most experienced officers and sergeants. Entire companies had been reduced to handfuls of survivors, and veteran regiments that had served with distinction from Germany to the West Indies were now little more than names on muster rolls. "A dear-bought victory," remarked his aide-de-camp, surveying the carnage with professional detachment. Howe nodded grimly. "Another such victory, and we are undone," he replied, unknowingly echoing the words of King Pyrrhus after his costly triumph over the Romans. The British had won the field, but at a cost that made victory indistinguishable from defeat. The colonial forces reformed on Winter Hill, just out of range of British artillery. Despite their tactical defeat, morale remained surprisingly high. They had proven to themselves and to the world that American farmers could stand against British regulars and give better than they received. The myth of British invincibility, carefully cultivated over decades of imperial expansion, had been shattered on a Massachusetts hillside by men who had run out of ammunition, but refused to run out of courage. Colonel Prescott conducted a careful count of his surviving men and found that despite the ferocity of the fighting, colonial casualties were remarkably light compared to British losses. Perhaps 400 Americans had been killed or wounded, while British losses exceeded 1,000. The mathematics of attrition warfare were clearly on the colonial side, provided they could maintain their supply of powder and shot. As evening fell over the battlefield, both armies settled into their respective positions and contemplated the day's events. The British controlled Charlestown Peninsula, but found themselves besieged by an enemy they had consistently underestimated. The Colonials had lost a battle, but gained something far more valuable: confidence in their ability to fight and win against the world's premier military power. News of the battle would spread throughout the colonies with remarkable speed, carried by writers who understood that the events of June 17th had changed everything. No longer could this conflict be dismissed as a minor colonial disturbance that would fade with the first show of British force. The smoke from 1,000 muskets still hung over Charlestown Peninsula as the sun began its descent toward the western hills, casting long shadows across a battlefield littered with the debris of empire. British burial parties worked through the evening, collecting their dead with the mechanical efficiency born of long military service. But even veteran sergeants paused occasionally to stare in disbelief at the magnitude of their losses. In his headquarters tent, General Thomas Gage read Major General Howe's after-action report with growing alarm. The numbers told a story that challenged every assumption about colonial military capability. over 40% casualties among the attacking force, including a devastating toll among junior officers who formed the backbone of British military organization. These were losses that would take months to replace, if they could be replaced at all so far from home. Sir, ventured his adjutant carefully, perhaps we should consider opening negotiations with the colonial leadership. Surely after today's demonstration of British resolve. Gage's laugh was bitter. We've demonstrated nothing but our own mortality. These rebels have learned that British soldiers bleed and die just like anyone else. That knowledge is worth more to them than all the military supplies in our magazines. Meanwhile, in Cambridge, the surviving colonial officers were conducting their own assessment of the day's events. General Artemus Ward, the overall commander of Massachusetts forces, listened gravely as Colonel Prescott described the final moments atop Reed's Hill. The tactical defeat stung, but the strategic implications were overwhelmingly positive. Word was already spreading throughout New England that American farmers had stood toe-to-toe with British regulars and emerged victorious in all but the narrowest technical sense. According to contemporary accounts preserved in the Colonial Society of Massachusetts records, the psychological impact of Bunker Hill extended far beyond the immediate participants. Throughout the 13 colonies, men who had wavered in their commitment to armed resistance suddenly found their resolve strengthened by news of the battle. If Massachusetts farmers could inflict such damage on British professionals, then perhaps independence was not the impossible dream it had seemed just months earlier. Young Samuel Adams, whose fiery rhetoric had helped precipitate the current crisis, received news of the battle while meeting with fellow patriots in Philadelphia. The details confirmed his deepest beliefs about American character and British vulnerability. Our cause is just, he declared to his companions, and our countrymen have proven they possess the courage to defend it. The tyrants in London will learn that Americans cannot be conquered by force of arms. The strategic situation had indeed changed dramatically before Bunker Hill. British officials could reasonably hope that a show of overwhelming force would bring the colonies back into line without protracted warfare. Now it was clear that any military solution would require massive reinforcements and years of bloody campaigning against an enemy that had proven unexpectedly formidable. Captain John Chester of Connecticut, who had arrived with reinforcements during the battle's final stages, wrote to his wife that evening, "The sight of our brave countrymen standing so firm against such odds has filled my heart with pride such as I have never known. We are no longer subjects begging for redress of grievances, but free men defending our rights with arms. The world will take notice of what happened here today." The wounded from both sides filled every available building in Boston and Cambridge, providing a grim reminder of the battle's cost. Yet even among the colonial casualties, morale remained remarkably high. They had given proof of American valor that would echo through generations, transforming the colonial rebellion from a political dispute into something approaching a genuine war of independence. British reinforcements were already on the way from England, but they would arrive to find a situation fundamentally altered by the events of June 17th. The rebellion could no longer be dismissed as the work of a few agitators who would collapse at the first show of force. 6 months after the guns fell silent on Breed's Hill, the ramifications of that bloody afternoon continued to reshape the political landscape of North America. In London, King George III received reports from his commanders with growing frustration, realizing that what had begun as a minor colonial disturbance had evolved into something requiring the full attention of the British military establishment. The ammunition shortage that had ultimately forced the colonial retreat had become a rallying cry throughout the 13 colonies. Remember, Bunker Hill became more than a slogan. It became a promise that American resolve would never again be found wanting. When the cause of liberty was at stake, colonial communities that had previously contributed money and moral support to the rebellion now began sending their sons to join the growing Continental Army. General George Washington, newly appointed as Commander-in-Chief of Colonial Forces, made a pilgrimage to the battlefield during his first weeks in Massachusetts. Standing where Dr. Warren had fallen, he understood that these amateur soldiers had accomplished something that professional military men had thought impossible. They had proven that Americans could fight, and that knowledge would sustain the rebellion through the dark years ahead. The British, meanwhile, found themselves trapped by their own victory. Holding Charlestown Peninsula required substantial garrison forces that could not be used for offensive operations elsewhere. More critically, The casualty list from Bunker Hill had sobered military planners in London who were beginning to comprehend the true cost of subduing the American colonies by force. Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie of the 22nd Foot, wounded during the final assault on the redoubt, wrote to his father from his hospital bed in Boston, "We have won the field, but at such cost that victory feels indistinguishable from defeat. These colonials fight with a determination I have never encountered. Even among European regulars, they may lack our training and discipline, but they possess something equally valuable. They believe their cause is just." The legend of Bunker Hill grew with each telling, as stories of individual heroism spread throughout the colonies. Peter Salem's shot that killed Major Pitcairn became the stuff of tavern tales, while Colonel Prescott's calm leadership under fire inspired countless young men to enlist in the Continental cause. Even the British developed a grudging respect for enemies who had stood their ground. Despite overwhelming odds and dwindling ammunition. In the months that followed, both sides worked feverishly to address the lessons learned from the battle. The Americans established powder mills and munitions factories, determined never again to face British steel with empty muskets. The British, for their part, abandoned the frontal assault tactics that had proved so costly and began developing new strategies for dealing with an enemy that refused to fight according to European conventions. Dr. Benjamin Rush, writing in his journal that winter, reflected on the battle's broader significance. What happened at Bunker Hill has transformed U.S. from subjects seeking redress into citizens defending our homeland. The blood spilled on that Massachusetts hilltop has watered the seeds of a new nation, one that will be born in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. The ammunition shortage that had ultimately forced the colonial retreat became, paradoxically, one of the battle's most inspiring elements. Later generations would remember not that the Americans had been forced to withdraw, but that they had stood their ground until their powder was exhausted, fighting with stones and musket butts when their cartridges ran dry. It became a metaphor for American determination. Even when resources failed, resolve would endure. As 1775 drew to a close, both sides prepared for the longer conflict that Bunker Hill had made inevitable. The British began planning massive reinforcements and new strategies for dealing with colonial resistance, while the Americans worked to transform their amateur militia into a professional army capable of sustained warfare. The battle that had begun with a colonial ammunition shortage had taught both sides that this would be a war of endurance, where victory would go to whichever side could maintain its will to fight longest. The echoes of those musket volleys would reverberate through American history, reminding future generations that liberty sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice, and that ordinary citizens, when defending their homes and families, can accomplish extraordinary things. The farmers who had climbed Breed's Hill that June morning had created more than earthworks. They had laid the foundation stones of American independence.